This is so stressful.
Hi, everyone from all corners of the globe.
We're so thrilled to have you all in this exhibition, and we have loved working with each and every one of you. But this is the first chance for you all to meet one another. And I think it's kind of strangely and beautifully poetic that this is how we're meeting for a show about loneliness. Before we begin, I'm going to acknowledge on behalf of everyone on this call the traditional owners of the lands and waterways from which we come, from where I am and where ACCA is built. That's the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung, Boonwurrung and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nations, and we pay our respects to their elders past, present, and future. I thought we could just do very quickly if everyone wanted to introduce themselves and their practice. I don't know, Melissa, you're here first. Did you want to quickly intro yourself?
Hi, I'm Melissa. I'm a painter from Melbourne, and for the show, I'm doing some rabbit skin glue paintings on canvas.
Hi, I'm Callum. I'm also based in Melbourne. I kind of make installation across a span of mediums. For the show, I've made a video installation kind of exploring party culture here in Melbourne and the kind of tensions between being together and alone in the same space.
Hey, I'm Patrick. I'm based in Melbourne. I'm originally a New Zealander. I make works out of collections, really. And it's a shopping project, my so-called practice.
Yeah, my name's Polly Borland, and I live in Los Angeles, but I'm Australian. Most of my work's really about what it is to be human, what it is to be alive, and what it is to die. And, along the way, loneliness and sort of existential crisis sort of permeates my work.
Hi, I'm Lucy. My work is about just having that isolation, even if you're in a group or in a crowd, whether it's intimate or, family or friends or just people in general, and just trying to find the connections that we all are looking for.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Kelly. I'm a filmmaker originally from New Orleans, now based in Los Angeles. Very interested in kind of exploring the human condition, universal human themes, what it means to be human, often through a darkly comedic or speculative science fiction lens.
My name is Gideon Appah. I'm a visual artist, and my work is very deep into the cultural fabric in Ghana's past and present. I do a lot of paintings of scenes, and currently I'm just working on scenes that have to do with leisure and pleasure in Ghanaian social fabric.
Hi, I'm Nick Mullaly. I'm a painter based in Melbourne, and I like to make paintings about romance and desire.
I'm Seth. I'm a new media artist. I live in California. My work typically involves chasing a new technology and finding a fun way to use it. And yeah, usually I'm surprised by what I come up with as well.
Which part of your practice, if any, is the most lonely or the most responsive to the feeling of loneliness? And do you think being an artist is an inherently lonely profession?
Well, I think, as some of the artists on the call have said, loneliness is almost a state of mind, like you can be lonely in a crowd. It's interesting, recently in Los Angeles, some of the events that I've gone to, I've really understood there's a real community. That has made me feel better about the state of the world. Knowing there are people that are supporting each other and pursuing some kind of truth. Connection for me is definitely the point.
That's a really interesting point. I'd love others to jump in on. Connection and loneliness has been a consistent theme throughout the show, whether it's being lonely in a crowd or whether it's finding connection alone in nature or in some other way. So can anyone else speak to perhaps how that relates in your own practice, this idea of connection versus loneliness?
I am a very big fan of natural reserves and with trees, rocks. I have painted a lot with my paintings. I've painted a lot of figures and landscapes. And always, sometimes I have works that have just a single figure just standing in the middle of this very huge canvas, and the background is just nothing. It could just be like an abstract nature of water, and of the foreground and of the sky. Sometimes I just take a stroll through some part of Ghana, and that's feeling or nostalgia that you get whilst you walk along an empty shore. And there is this kind of absence that kind of engulfs me sometimes when I work there. There's always that sense of being lonely or being very little in front of all these natural things.
I think it's unique, very unique, because, as artists, you know the familiarity of sequestering yourself in your studio, and I'm sure every one of you has had moments of isolation in developing the work for this show. Lucy, I was going to ask you to comment on this, because I think there's a really interesting counterpoint between something that all artists would understand, which is the loneliness of being alone and making your work and kind of trying to communicate that. But then there's the loneliness of being in the world and going to an art opening and bumping into people and them not really knowing you, but maybe more knowing about you. Do you have any reflections on that?
Loneliness is definitely something that is internal, and you can be in a crowd of people and still feel quite lonely, or be in an intimate relationship and still feel that way because you're not present. There's the loneliness of having conflict between yourself and the next step that you need to take emotionally. One thing is keeping you from growing, inhibiting you from that, and the other is a step towards growing. And there's a real difference in that. It's just you don't know until in retrospect which one was which. But either way, you are, that vessel holding both of those things. So those two things can be true simultaneously. It's just what choice do you make? And it's sort of like when you're in that moment of being present, or not present, when will you step in and engage? Number one, like when can you get out of your own way? And then secondly, to push through to something difficult, or whether it's a memory, you have to break through something else. And that's a lonely thing to do because no one else can do it for you. They can encourage you, they can support you, but you have to be the one to really do it. And it's terrifying. And it's something that we all have to do. I mean, children have to do it, babies do it, they have to take their first step and fall. And no one really wants to fall. So it's that feeling of knowing that when you fall, you just have to get up. So there's other steps behind it.
Do you think it's interesting that perhaps it's also the places where you fall down and the mistakes along the way that can make the beauty of an artwork? Patrick, I wanted to ask you on this because your work to me strikes me as the perfect metaphor for the multifaceted, conflicting kind of nature of loneliness and its stubborn irresistance to definition.
What I tend to do is start with found photographs, which you can see sorted behind me, and I've got about 130 categories I work in, and so this one I just worked into the word and the idea of loneliness. And I started with photos, and then I went to things and objects. So it could be a novel like Miss Lonely Hearts, or it could be a 19th century locket of hair woven as a memorial of some past person. And then I would find very quickly, it's funny how you get the whole tragic comic range of life and politics, and everything creeps in. You think you're just collecting one thing under a constraint, and always the world creeps in, which is sort of the point of the work, really. So you get everything from discarded engagement ring to a photograph of a person on the beach, howling at the beach, and then you realize the person's been cut out, and so they're gone. They're a locket victim. So just these sort of pieces of life that creep into objects and things and materials. I don't have to do anything with these shopping projects. I just find things, really, and they come. I don't want to say they come to me. It sounds too grand, but the world is like the whole tragic comic melody of loneliness. It's always beneath the surface. The lonely pursuit and the crowd. It's always in there. Yeah.
I think that there is a consistency across each of your practice, which I see as a sort of searching. I wanted to throw this next question to Callum and Nick, because I see your work as two sides of the same nocturnal coin, but in both instances, it's about searching. How do you both reflect, I suppose, on loneliness and connection? Maybe we'll start with you, Nick.
Oh yeah, so it's definitely, you're really stepping out into the public sphere, like say going out to the nightclub or something, and then seeing all these people, and it can feel quite riveting and like exciting to be around other people. But I guess for an artist, being in the studio and spending time alone there, like, yeah, there's such a push and pull being introverted and then going into an extroverted kind of space. In my paintings, there's still a little bit of a kind of tension. It represents so many like potential kind of avenues of the way a night could go.
I think it's a great point to bring you in, Callum, because as I said, I see there's a kind of beautiful synergy, but also tension between your work and Nick's. Could you talk to that?
Yeah, of course. I think I've been working in this space before, and in kind of previous examples it had been through archival footage or other people's footage. And so over the last few years, I began kind of filming the dance floor myself, and something that, yeah, I noticed and that became a reoccurring motif in the footage was a sea of phones. I started thinking about this idea of mediation and presentness, and like, on the one hand, I'm trying to record and document and almost historicize in my own way a specific scene here in Melbourne in Australia. But also what I'm noticing is other people doing that. And I guess there's starting to think about why people are recording and who is it for? And, does all this footage end up at some point in an artist like Patrick Pound's archive, 50 years time or something? So that was something for me. And the dance floor became the subject of the work in a way. And then on the other side, the animated footage, there's all these shots that lead to the dance floor, and in place of it, it becomes these artworks, whether or not ones that I've made in the past or artists who've been working this space that I've been inspired by. And I think to me, that was, thinking about then the gallery becoming a space of thought, isolation, and thinking.
Well, I actually think that it's been really quite telling that so many artists in the show have looked also to that relationship between technology and isolation. The tools that are meant to connect us often make us feel more divided or disconnected than ever before. Seth, I think there's really no artist in the show who perhaps makes that metaphor more apparent than yourself, the endless Sisyphean struggle of the doom scroll. So, Seth, can you talk to us, I guess, a bit about technology as a metaphor, or this idea of being both connected and disconnected by the tools meant to bring us together?
Absolutely. As a chronically online individual myself, I find it hard to actually be lonely. By that, I mean to say, I find it hard to remain lonely. At any moment in time, I can bust out my phone, swipe a little bit, say what's up to a friend. Boom, loneliness is solved, but not for long. And that's not normal. That's not healthy. That's not even nutritious. That's candy instead of fruit. That's chips instead of vegetables. That's ultra processed meat on a stick instead of a sit down meal with some loved ones. I think that the corporations that allow this sort of quick hit to happen um, are not doing so without awareness. And I think it's very important for us, as becoming ultra processed meat on a stick, we need to take control of our own um, interactions with others. So rather than scrolling endlessly, at the very least, call someone or hop on a Zoom call with a baker's dozen of artists from across the globe and discuss things that actually mean something instead of just liking selfies.
We are most of us chronically online, but art is a moment to stand in front of something and feel something and have a real encounter. I wanted to talk about one theme that has been also kind of interesting within the show, and it's both in your work, Melissa, and in your work, Lucy. Now, both of you come from a sort of second generation migrant families, and both of you have looked to your relationship with your mother as inspiration as part of your painting practice. Would you both be able to speak to that idea of loneliness and childhood, and perhaps how that manifests in your work?
Particularly for like my life, there wasn't a lot of like communication about love and deep conversations, I guess. And so when I started thinking about this project of just reconnecting with my mother, it was one because she lives in Adelaide. And so it's like a different way to connect with her. And I found that writing letters was like a way of having another form of intimacy. There's vulnerability in just actually just writing the letters and just sending it off and waiting like a weeks for the response and not knowing what's coming back. Yeah, it was just like a way of like reconnecting with my mom and kind of wanting to know more about her, wanting to know what she was like back when she was like my age, and just processing that immense, I guess, loneliness that she would have felt as like a refugee.
And Lucy, in a similar way, I feel your practice draws on kind of trans historical references, but then also immediate family references, which becomes manifest in, the works that you're showing with us are based on Edo period Japanese shunga, a form of erotic art, but they hold extraordinary metaphor and nuance for your own memories of, I suppose, the privacy, the shrouding in the public life. Would you mind talking a little around that?
I think that there's something very dynamic about how different cultures hold the body. And that's not just in terms of sexuality, but it also encompasses communication. I think very much what Melissa was saying earlier. There's kind of a lack of communication, but in that silence, there's a lot of dynamic conversation that's happening, but it's not really happening. So you don't really know ultimately where they're coming from. You're just assuming. I think the explosion of those smaller wood carvings and those blocks would be almost kind of like charged with taking a pixel and like blowing it up and trying to discover something and search for something that you just can't find or you didn't have in your past so that you could refer to it. And so I think that a lot of people might feel like they're quite sexual, but it's actually just about how intimate something is, but how separate they are still, right? So the for me, I think that the question is constant, which is like, what is the relationship between you and a person is also the relationship between you and your family. So if there was no connection there, no matter how close you are to somebody, there's no connection. No matter, whether that is a relationship that is, seems inseparable, what kind of attachment is that? And, that to me is a way of understanding yourself better and yourself as a child better. So to look at yourself not as a grown up, and in some ways what Melissa said about I'm seeing my family now as they were before they had a family, and what were their dreams and their hopes and what changed once they did have a family and that kind of responsibility, so that you capture who they were before you. Because when you're a child, you're quite, all children think about it are themselves, and they don't think outside of that. And it's very different now that I have my own child. I can sort of see the generational aspect of what we hold on to and what we don't let go of and what we can break for future generations, hopefully.
Your works from the Shunga series are in the same space as Gideon's video work and painting as well. So Gideon, I'll turn to you. I'd love to hear a bit about why you're drawn to Fauvism and the use of color and the use of the embracing of the subjective viewing of your work to kind of explore your strong connection to Akan culture and thinking.
I normally see color in a very abstract sense, and so some of my canvases that I've done, some actually I have to do a lot of painting of acrylics in the background to turn the canvases black before I start to use colors on them. So that became some way that was using to subdue the the strength of most of the colors, and also um as a personal way of dealing with my paintings, how I wanted the paintings to appear. So that painting that I have in there with the boy with the bird, um, is the colors. I had intentionally wanted the colors to have this kind of like the day setting. So, I use a lot of underlayings of colors, and then to start painting from darkness into light, and it's always been my way of dealing with color.
Emotion and color are very intertwined, I think, because color has such power to set a mood, and it can change your mood or reflect your mood. And I think we've got a beautiful pink room in the show with Natasha Matilla-Smith's work and Polly Borland's work. And Polly, I'd love to hear a bit about your kind of inclinations to using color in a very intentional way, or kind of opening up ambiguity.
Well, I use a lot of pink and a lot of colour that sort of suggests nude skin. So my work is sculptural in this show, which is I've moved into sculpture actually since COVID. The last body of work I'd done with photography was my photographing my own body. You know, I'm in my 60s, and I'd always worked intensely with mainly women, and mainly, you know, clothes off and a lot of skin. And I decided to turn the camera on myself. So most of the sculptures, I've experimented a bit with colour, and most of my work's experimental at this point in my creative life. And I've experimented with colour, and I used to sort of think that I was going to be a great colourist, and I'm not sure that I am. But I love pink. I never really was a pink girl, but I've become a pink person. And I love pink. And it's weird. I don't know why. A lot of it's about skin for me. Not that we're all pink, because we're not, but it's related to my skin, I think. This particular work that's in this show is to do with the human form, but also the abstraction of human form.
As you're saying, it's flesh, it's brain, it's a sunset. It's more than just like a binary. And I see that in your work. And I kind of have associated Bod, the beautiful big sculpture, and its kind of forlorn, collapsing position, with the term by Glenn Albrecht, who coined the term solastalgia, which means to be homesick for your own home due to environmental degradation, and seeing how your environment changes before your very eyes despite never having moved. Kelly, I'd love to hear about your approach to such a kind of somber topic of animals that are the last of their species, and using humor to kind of tell that story.
The genesis for Emling actually comes from a real story, a real article I discovered on the Atlantic by journalist Ed Yong. And he profiled a real life endling custodian, a biologist named David Seashow, who kind of uprooted his whole life to take care of this lost thriving tree snail that was endemic to Hawaii. And that article was very humorous on the surface. I think David approaches his work with a very positive, lighthearted perspective and this innate joy of what he does. So that was kind of something that struck me the first time of reading it. And then beneath that, you know, I think the very somber reality of the nature of his job. And you know, this question I've always had about, you know, throughout our history, how there's always been a human who has devoted their life to taking care of this species that has no chance of survival. What is the reason? Is it defiance? Is it contrition? Or is that act of defiance perhaps a way that we find joy in the face of hopelessness and nihilism? And so I think that juxtaposition and that dichotomy always interests me as a filmmaker. So yeah, I think, you know, the approach and the decision to frame what could seem like a very fantastical subject matter as a mockumentary, a documentary, a form that has always been rooted in truth, and then also kind of embracing a comedic, absurd tone as a way kind of into the story. And then hopefully at the end, kind of embracing a tonal shift to kind of, highlight the realities of, I think, what it is to be human, which is experiencing this broad range of emotions that are not black and white, to be somber and to be grieving something while also laughing and smiling and enjoying kind of living in the joy that comes from also being alive and on this earth.
There is extraordinary joy in your work, Kelly. My great mentor and my dear friend who's now departed, Cuckoo Arab Mare artist Destiny Deacon used to say that she liked to make people laugh. That way they didn't feel the knife go in. And I feel like there's a tension between comedy and tragedy that actually has manifested in some capacity in each of your works. This idea of how we make sense of feelings, whether we make sense of them through humor, whether we make sense of them through connection, through intimacy, through sex, through love, through dancing. The question is, how would you describe the feeling of loneliness, and how do you see loneliness in your work?
I think the realization that, no matter how intimately you can share your life with others, that your subjective, inner experiences and private memories and consciousness ultimately will always belong to you. And that is very lonely, but I also think that is, also very beautiful because everyone at the same time is experiencing that inner loneliness. And in a way, perhaps it is not so lonely at the end of the day, to think about it like that. I'm a writer director, and that practice is often so easily lumped into one, but and separated only by a hyphen or a slash. But um, they're so different because writing is so lonely. I have spent years alone with just my computer and my own thoughts, working on something. But then directing is something that is not lonely. It involves so many people. And I think that has just been a very interesting and beautiful dichotomy that I've been very wrestling with. But I think it's to go from kind of a very lonely practice to then something that can only come alive with community and collaboration.
Well, I feel like it would be remiss of me not to throw to you, Lucy, as someone who I'm sure has had the experience of, I imagine when you work on a crew, there could be up to, 200 people. But in order to be an artist, it's generally you alone in the studio. How would you talk to that?
I think it's definitely something that has evolved over time. I spent a lot of time on my own as a child, and I really enjoyed it. And I think there's something really beautiful about what Kelly said about loneliness not necessarily being, a bad thing. It's something that has to come from a place of understanding that it's important to be able to be with yourself. And I think a lot of times people don't think they can do that. And you have to be brave to be lonely. And you have to be brave enough to understand that you can also step out of that if it's a loneliness that is creating a vortex. So I enjoy both, and I've gotten more accustomed to being around people. And that's helped me be a better creative person. So what used to fuel me started to then to anchor me. And I think that I've kind of grown into this place where I find the abundance of the feeling of love of the people that I surround myself with. That helps me to be a better, more creatively courageous person. And I don't think that I knew that back then. I think I was brave in a different way. And now I'm braver in a more global way. And I think that's something that everybody may find in their lives. But I think, it's like that angst that you grow out of, essentially. And you grow into a different angst, but it's an angst that because you've had heartbreak, you've had your heart filled. Everyone has to experience heartbreak one way or another, right? Whether it's the environment or a relationship or a parent or a friend, passing on, or disease. There's always something that you learn in that. And so I think loneliness it's a meter and it's not just one thing. And I think, when you hear the word, it sounds so dangerous, but it shouldn't be.
Everyone gets lonely. It's a fundamental part of what it means to be a human being. And it can both be a powerful motivator and producer. It can be the inspiration for an incredible art practice, and it can be debilitating. It can be all things at once, two things.
I think for me, loneliness is being in a state of fear and fear of other people and humanity, and for me, that's something I've been grappling with particularly in the last few years. And the sort of powerlessness around other people's behaviour. So that being fearful of other people tends to make me feel very isolated and also makes me want to isolate. In my sculptures, there's human beings. I make the sculptures around a real human being and I engulf them in stuffing and stockings, and the way they describe it is being sensorily deprived. So it's sort of sensory deprivation. So for them, it's quite lonely. And I think that comes out in the work, even though you don't really know that there's a person in those sculptures. I feel like it brings a humanity to the work. It can, have that feeling of loneliness when you look at the work because there is a real human being in the work when I make it.
I see that in your work. We've talked about bed rotting, we've talked about doom scrolling, and I see in your work, Polly, made physical the kind of internal states that influence us.
I just learned this, but there is now a term they've coined, the epoch to precede the Anthropocene, what will come next, after the age of humans, and I just learned it's called the Eremocene, which means the age of loneliness is the translation for that.
Oh, wow.
So thought I'd just share that.
That's
That is
amazing.
fantastic. It's
Yeah.
our absolute honor to be lonely together on this show and to be able to share your works. And thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.